Alpha King Kale Draven and Seraphina Vale chained Luna Lyra Valen to the stone wall deep beneath Nightfang Palace, declared her a traitor, and drove a silver blade through her heart, never suspecting that her death would awaken the very queen they feared most. They believed they had buried Lyra's power beneath the stone forever, never imagining that the woman they had just murdered would return as a death sentence hanging over both their thrones. If the husband and the best friend you trusted most killed you simply because they feared what you could become, what would you do? The metallic tang of blood filled Lyra Valen's lungs as the silver blade slid between her ribs. Kale stood directly before her, his hands white-knuckled as they tightened around the hilt. He looked into her face as if still waiting for her to say the one last thing that would make this easier. Behind him, Seraphina knelt on one leg, holding a sacrificial bowl beneath the wound and watching every drop of blood hit the basin. She never looked away, not even when Lyra's hand twitched in the silver shackles. The silver chains cut deep into Lyra's wrists. Still, she lifted her head. "You aren't killing me because I betrayed you," she whispered. "You're killing me because I showed you just how weak you really are." Kale's jaw tightened. He did not pull the blade out. Through a narrow vent in the dungeon ceiling, red light poured down in a thin, sharp streak across the stone floor. The blood moon was reaching its peak. Lyra looked at the chains. Then she looked at her husband. "You two are afraid I'll become your death sentence," she said. "So I'll become exactly what you just created." Kale drove the blade in another inch. She did not scream. He would remember that detail long after the sound of the silver chains hitting the floor faded. Her heart stopped, and the mate bond between them did not snap cleanly. It tore a jagged rift running from her chest to his remaining there like a second invisible blade. The streak of red light on the floor widened. The blood in Seraphina's bowl began to boil. 4 months before that night, the only thing Lyra Valen feared losing was her husband's faith. The people of Nightfang called her Luna, the way one speaks of a sanctuary. She would walk through the market at the foot of the citadel, stopping at every stall, remembering the name of the tanner's third child, placing her hand on an old Omega's swollen knee and holding it there until the pain receded. Her healing ability was no ritual. It was just 2 hands and a warmth running beneath her skin that she assumed she had inherited from her mother's noble bloodline. No one in Nightfang, not even she herself, knew she was the last descendant of the Blood Moon Queen. She had never wanted the throne. She wanted something smaller and far more difficult, a kingdom where Omegas could own land, where fallen soldiers had their names recorded, and where weak packs were not crushed under the negotiating tables of the great houses. Kale Draven had truly loved her. The problem was that he had been raised on a single sentence his father repeated, like a nail being driven home: an Alpha King only exists in the distance between himself and the second most powerful person in the room. Then the vampires crossed the northern border. Kale led his army himself. By the second day, the front line had been pushed back 3 miles. Hundreds of warriors lay in the snow with bite wounds that refused to close, and 4-pack alphas on the border lost their ability to shift because the vampire venom had seeped into their marrow. The orders sent back to the palace were clear: the Luna was to stay in the city. Lyra took the fastest horse in the stables and defied her husband's orders for the first time in 4 years of marriage. She arrived at the battlefield before dawn. She moved among the wounded, tearing her cloak into strips for bandages, tying the knots with her teeth when her hands grew slick with blood. Then she looked up and saw Kale kneeling in the snow, one hand holding his side, 3 vampires circling behind him. The thing that lay dormant within her opened its eyes before she could even call its name. A ring of silver-red light spread from Lyra's body, low and fast, racing across the snow like water overflowing a basin. Wherever the light touched, bite wounds sealed shut. The black smoke of vampire venom rose from the injuries and burned away in the air. Wolves who had lost control, wolves who were biting their own kin, stopped mid-stride and bowed their heads. Nightfang won that battle. No commander on the field believed they had won it because of Kale. The army reached the capital 9 days later. The people stood packed on both sides of the road from the outer gate to the palace steps, and they were not chanting the king's name. Luna Lyra, the savior of Nightfang. Kale stood beside his wife on the highest stone step and smiled down at the crowd just as an Alpha King should. When they went inside, the leather of his right glove was damp, and the servant who replaced it saw 4 crescent moon marks carved deep into his own palm. The council meeting 3 days later went almost too smoothly. Both border commanders and the cavalry general proposed something simple: give the Luna authority over the kingdom's healing forces, and a seat at the table when the council discussed military strategy. Kale dismissed the notion before the second person could finish their sentence. Lyra did not argue with her husband in front of the council. She only said in a voice quiet enough that only the front row could hear that she was not asking for more power. She only wanted those who died for Nightfang to be treated as if they had died for something. Then she sat down. Behind her, the three commanders exchanged looks. Kale saw that look. That night he went down to the royal archives alone, carrying a lamp. I was not looking for proof. He was looking for a name. What he found was in a scroll of sheepskin tied outside the official chronicles, a line handwritten in a script older than his ancestors' reign. When the blood moon awakens, the one wearing the false crown shall kneel before the true queen. Kale read the line 4 times. He thought of the sound of the crowd outside the city gates and the fact that his name was not in those cheers. The only person he spoke to about that prophecy was not an elder. Seraphina Vale had been by Lyra's side since they were 12 years old. What Lyra did not know was that Seraphina had been sent to Nightfang with a purpose, an exiled princess of the Crimson Vale sent to find the carrier of the Blood Moon bloodline, and she had stayed far longer than any mission required. The mission had expired long ago. What replaced it was a pure, patient jealousy fueled by 15 years of sitting in the second row. Seraphina was jealous of the mate bond Lyra never had to beg for. Most of all, she was jealous of the power Lyra never stole from anyone, a bloodline that could make both werewolves and vampires bow their heads, and it resided in the only friend who had never doubted her once. The night Kale summoned her to his private chambers, Seraphina had been his secret lover for half a year. She arrived, closed the door, and saw the sheepskin scroll open on the desk. Kale did not invite her to sit. He pushed the scroll toward her with 2 fingertips, as if touching more of it would make the words true. "If Lyra truly is the Blood Moon Queen," he said, "how do I stop her from awakening?" Seraphina let the silence stretch long enough for the king to hear his own question echo in the room. "You're asking the wrong question," she said. "What lies inside Lyra is not a power to be measured. It is older than Nightfang. If it fully awakens, she will be more powerful than every Alpha King who has worn this crown, including your father, including you." She did not speak of death. She didn't have to. "I only ask you 3 things," she said. "What happens when the army obeys her before they obey you? What happens when the council decides Nightfang needs a queen instead of a king? And what happens the day Lyra realizes she no longer needs you?" "She has never wanted my crown," Kale said the words, sounding like he was reciting a clause from a peace treaty. "Not once in 4 years. Perhaps she doesn't want to today." Seraphina closed the sheepskin ledger. "Power changes people. You know that better than I do." Meanwhile, Lyra was waiting for that very friend to come over for tea. She told Seraphina things she wouldn't share with anyone else. That Kale hadn't slept in their room for 3 weeks. That she was afraid she had done something at the northern border that made her husband feel small, and she had no idea how to give him back that space. "If I have to, I'll give back half of my authority," Lyra said. "The healing forces, the border reports, all of it. I don't need to stand as his equal. I just need him to go back to being the man I married." Seraphina took both of Lyra's hands in hers and said exactly the things a friend should say. Then she leaned in, adjusting the friendship charm at her neck so its silver clasp grazed the back of Lyra's hand. The scratch was so small that Lyra only narrowed her eyes slightly. That night, a single drop of blood on the inside of the clasp was enough for Seraphina to confirm what her people had been searching for 40 years. That blood didn't react like a werewolf's blood. It sucked the candlelight in and held it. 2 days later, she placed a solution instead of a death sentence on Kale's desk. "A sealing ritual," Seraphina said. "Temporary. It won't kill her, it won't take anything away from her, it will just lock away what's in her blood until you find a way to control it. Lyra will still be your Luna. She just won't be a threat to you anymore." "What do you want?" "Access to the royal archives. Everything, including the volumes kept outside the official timeline." She paused. "And for my people in Nightfang to be protected by you. No public announcements. No official records." Kale agreed that very same evening. He told himself he had just saved his wife from a death no one had even proposed yet. Elder Malric arrived 3 days later carrying what he called a report. Malric wasn't afraid of the Blood Moon. He was afraid of a very specific list: land ownership rights, the right to choose an Omega's pack, the right to a public trial. So he spread out 6 sheets of paper before the king, claiming that the border warriors were secretly swearing loyalty to the Luna, not the crown. Kale, read it all. He asked who had verified it. Malric replied that no one had, and that waiting for verification would be too late. That was where Kale still could have stopped. Instead, he summoned 4 of his personal guards and ordered them to track his wife. On the 4th night, he went himself. He stood in the dark corridor above the military infirmary courtyard and looked down. Lyra was sitting on the stone steps surrounded by nearly 40 people. She was distributing medicine with her own hands, not through a servant. She opened a leather-bound notebook and wrote down the name of every warrior who had died at the northern border, then wrote the names of their wives, mothers, and children on the lines below. She promised a soldier who had lost his arm that someone would be sent to plow his fields for the coming season. 40 soldiers. A notebook full of names, promises made that didn't go through the king. Kale stood there for a long time and didn't hear a single word of what she said. He only saw the shape of it, a woman, a list, and the men who would remember who had saved them. She didn't ask for your permission, Seraphina said from behind him, because in her mind, Nightfang already belongs to her. Kale didn't go down into the courtyard. He didn't call his wife's name, didn't ask what was written in that notebook, and didn't demand an explanation that would have taken only 2 minutes to hear. The next morning he called for Malric and ordered him to gather evidence against the Luna of Nightfang. As for Seraphina, for 3 nights straight, she worked with Lyra's blood in the room beneath the library that the king had just opened for her. The result was always the same, that power doesn't leave its host like an object changing hands. It must be gifted, or it must be won under conditions that the ancient scrolls called by exactly 3 words under the blood moon. She didn't report that back to Kale. She wrote it down, folded the paper into her shirt, and went to sleep with her hand resting on the friendship charm at her neck. 9 days later, Kale organized a grand ceremony to honor the Luna of Nightfang for the victory at the northern border. The Great Hall was fully opened, including the 2 southern doors that were usually only unsealed for coronations. When the tailor brought the ceremonial robes, Lyra touched the silver embroidery on the sleeves and believed that her husband had finally stopped viewing her power as a problem to be solved. She stood out in the hallway waiting for the trumpets, and she told Seraphina what she had decided. Tonight after the ceremony, I'll speak to him before the council. I'm returning the authority to manage the healing forces. I'm stepping down from the border reports. If I have to, I'll step down from the council entirely. Lyra adjusted her sleeve. I don't want to defeat my husband, I just want him to be able to sleep. Seraphina heard that and realized something that made her blood run cold. Lyra had never, not for a single day, wanted the throne. That should have been a reason to stop. But what rose up in Seraphina wasn't mercy, it was a very strange anger, the anger of someone who had traveled 40 years to win something that the person holding it was willing to give away for nothing. During the feast, Seraphina stood to Lyra's right for 2 hours and personally handed her the silver cup. The substance in the cup wasn't a lethal poison. It was an extract from silver root that severed the connection between a werewolf and their wolf. Lyra drank it all because her friend gave it to her. She set the cup down, finished the sentence she was speaking, and 10 minutes later her fingers stopped obeying her. The cup slid from her hand, hit the edge of the table, and rolled across the stone floor. The cup was still rolling when Elder Malric walked into the middle of the great hall. He carried a stack of letters tied with hemp, a list of names, and a map that he spread right out on the floor before the throne for 400 people to see. Then he accused Luna Lyra Valen of 4 crimes, reading them slowly, one by one: secret correspondence with Shadowfang, assembling a force of warriors loyal only to her, plotting to assassinate the Alpha King during the Blood Moon ritual, and preparing a hidden path for invaders to reach the capital. Lyra stepped down from the feast table. She snatched a letter from Malric's hand, opened it, and read. The handwriting looked so much like hers that an outsider wouldn't notice a thing. But the letter G at the end of the second line had a tail that curved to the right, and Lyra hadn't written a G like that since she was 13. This letter is a forgery, she said. She spoke to the entire hall, not to Malric. I demand a public investigation starting tonight. No, Kale rose from the throne. If I leave the Luna free for another day, Nightfang will descend into civil war. I am not gambling the kingdom on an investigation. Lyra turned to face her husband. The royal guards had formed a semicircle behind her. Look at me and answer one question, she said. Do you truly believe I betrayed you, or do you just need an excuse to stop being afraid of me? Kale did not answer. He raised one hand not high, just to his waist, and that was the entire command. Two guards seized Lyra's arms. A third removed the Luna badge from her shoulder. Lyra called for her wolf. She called with everything she had, and where there should have been an answer, there was only a void, warm and silent like a room that had just been stripped of all its furniture. They dragged her the entire length of the great hall. The stone floor beneath her heels passed by 400 people standing still, and not a single one stepped forward. Standing on the second step of the throne, Serafina stood perfectly still, her hands clasped over her stomach, her expression one of disciplined sorrow. The friendship token lay outside her collar. Lyra had personally placed it on Serafina during the summer of their 17th year. For 15 years, Serafina had always worn it tucked beneath her clothes, always saying that precious things should be hidden. Tonight, it lay exposed right under the lights in the very spot where Lyra couldn't help but see it. That was how she knew. And more painful than that, worse than the chill in her hands as they began to lose all feeling, was the realization that hit her as she glanced back at her husband. Cale hadn't been deceived. He stood there like a man who had just been handed exactly what he needed. The forged letters didn't convince him. They gave him permission. The great hall doors closed behind her. Inside, Cale announced to 400 people that Luna Lyra had plotted to assassinate the Alpha King of Nightfang, and that, for the safety of the kingdom, the execution would be carried out in private with no announced date and no witnesses outside of the council. Outside the city gates, the Nightfang commoners were told a different story, that when presented with the evidence, the Luna had attacked the king. The letters were taken to be burned that very night. No one in the hall considered that beneath the palace, 40 stone steps from where they stood, a survivor of the old dynasty remained, holding the originals of everything Malric had just forged. The air down there tasted of damp stone and old iron. They had lowered Lyra by a rope ladder, shackled her to the deepest wall, and used silver chains that had been soaked in vampire blood for 30 days. She understood their purpose in less than an hour. Her wolf wasn't dead. It was right there, just a layer of skin away, and she couldn't reach it. Serafina came down for the first time on the second night, carrying a thin blade and 3 vials. She offered no explanation. She sliced the inside of Lyra's elbow, filled the first vial, and sat on the stone step opposite to drink it right there. What happened next wasn't in any manuscript Serafina had ever read. Memories flooded into her. Not one of them, hers, a silver-haired woman standing on a snowy ridge commanding a wolf army without opening her mouth. Dozens of battles not named in the royal chronicles. And at the end, a woman's voice from a century-long past, speaking very slowly like someone explaining a rule to a child. This does not follow the one who claims it through betrayal. Serafina smashed the second vial against the stone floor. She crawled out of the dungeon with trembling hands, and she didn't tell Cale a single word. For 4 days, the only person to speak to Lyra was the old man in the cell 2 walls away. Rowan had been a royal scholar. He had been thrown down here back when Cale's father still reigned for doing something very small. He had refused to rewrite a chapter of history according to the amended version. "Do you know yet how the Draven line took the throne?" he asked through a crack in the wall. Lyra thought she knew. Rowan told her the other version. That before the Draven's Nightfang was ruled by a female lineage, and the last of them was betrayed by her own guards on a blood moon night. That the so-called Civil War was just a coup rewritten 40 years later by the victors, and that Shadowfang, the name every Nightfang child was taught, was the land of traitors, had never betrayed anyone. The people of Shadowfang were the descendants of those who had stood guard for the true queen, and they were pushed out to the northern rocks because they were living proof of who this crown was stolen from. "And the originals?" Lyra asked. "Not in the archives," Rowan coughed. "I'm not that foolish." On the 5th night, Lyra's foot struck a floor stone that sank deeper than the others. She scraped away the mortar with the lock of her chain for 4 hours. Beneath it was a hollow space just large enough for a person to crawl through, leading in the direction Rowan had described from his memory of the old Foundation maps. She pried the latch of one of the 2 silver chains with a piece of metal she broke from the hinge, leaving a long, jagged tear on her wrist, and crawled into the darkness. The tunnel was longer than she thought. She counted 217 crawls. Cale was waiting there, alone, no guards, no lights. Lyra didn't beg for mercy. She said what she had rehearsed in her head during those 200 crawls: hold a real investigation call, and the 3 border commanders compare the handwriting and the letters to her own ledgers. Then she said the part she knew was harder to hear. "I renounce all rights. No council, no healers, no name on any document. I will leave Nightfang tonight. And if that isn't enough, I will cut the mate bond." Kale was silent for so long that she could hear the water dripping in the tunnel below. His hands opened. In those few seconds he had nearly crossed to another side of himself. "And the people," Lyra said, "they deserve the truth, not about me, about the crown you're wearing." Kale's hand closed. He grabbed her elbow not roughly and led her back toward the tunnel entrance. He didn't shout, he didn't argue, and the very normalcy of it chilled her more than the silver chains. "I cannot let this kingdom discover that its Luna is stronger than its Alpha King," he said as he locked the second chain back into place. "You wouldn't understand. You've never had to hold on to something that everyone is waiting for you to lose." That was the moment Lyra stopped trying to explain herself to her husband. He hadn't been poisoned by Seraphina. He hadn't been led astray by Malric. He had stood at the end of the tunnel with empty hands, knowing full well the letters were fake, knowing full well she was offering to leave his life forever, and he still chose the chair. The next morning, Seraphina reported to him that the sealing ritual had failed. The blood didn't accept her, the mark wouldn't close, and the thing inside Lyra wasn't weakening in the dungeon. It was growing. "There is one way," she said. "She must die before the blood moon reaches its peak. You have 3 days." During those 3 days, 2 people offered 2 different pieces of advice. Elder Malric wanted a public execution in the main courtyard. Seraphina wanted the opposite. Kill her in the dungeon. No witnesses, then announced that the Luna had died while trying to escape through an old tunnel. She presented it in the voice of someone helping the king save face, and Kyle didn't ask why she needed the shadow so badly. On the 3rd night, he went down to the dungeon once more. Lyra didn't stand up. She sat leaning against the wall, both wrists swollen and black around the silver rings, and she asked for nothing. Now she only asked one question, her voice as dry as the stone around her. Were the last 4 years ever real? Even for just one winter would have been enough. "I loved you." Kale said it in the past tense, and he heard himself do it. "That doesn't change what you are now." "I am your wife." She lifted her eyes. "You aren't killing me because I betrayed you. You are killing me because I showed you just how weak you are." He stepped out of the dungeon before she finished her last word. The next morning he ordered the ritual chamber prepared and told Malric he would handle it himself. It wasn't to hide the kill. He told the council that an Alpha King must never delegate the duty of holding his own crown. The blood moon rose the following night. They stood Lyra upright in the ritual chamber, secured by 4 silver ropes pulled taut to the walls. Seraphina stood behind the stone altar with the ritual bowl in a half-drawn circle of chalk. Kyle stood before his wife holding the silver blade brought up from his father's armory. The rest happened as it had, to the silver blade hands tightening around the hilt. But there was one detail only Lyra knew. In the final beat, when she said she would become the very thing they had just created, the thing inside her blood didn't recoil. It opened slowly, calmly, like a door that had been waiting for this exact key for 400 years. Then the dungeon vanished. Where she stood afterward, there were no walls, no ceiling, no scent of damp stone. The ground beneath her was snow that felt no cold, and overhead the blood moon claimed nearly the entire sky. A woman emerged from the void. Silver hair, bare feet, bearing on her cheekbones the same mark Lyra now felt burning into her own skin. "I have waited for you longer than you know," the woman said. She was the first. And she told Lyra 3 things that neither Kyle nor Seraphina nor Malric understood when they chose the knife. That Lyra was not merely the last descendant. She was the chosen successor, marked while still in her mother's womb. And this bloodline was not passed on through natural death. That dying under a blood moon did not erase it. The blood moon was where it returned home. And that the final seal, the lock placed by 4 generations to keep the lineage dormant, could only be broken by one thing. "Being killed by your own fated mate," she said, "not by an enemy. An enemy only brings you death. Your husband is the only one who could turn the key." Lyra heard those words and felt something in herself even more uncomfortable than pain, a misplaced sense of relief from someone who just realized that none of it had been meaningless. "They took nothing from you," the woman continued. "They just unlocked you." She could return. But the woman didn't state it as a gift. She recited the 3 costs clear and cold. First, every time Lyra tapped into the highest tier of her power, she would lose a precious memory of her old life. Not knowledge, not skills. Memories. The things that made her her. Second, she could only touch her full strength under the blood moon. On other nights she would be stronger than an alpha, but she would not be a queen. Third, and she paused before this one, if she let hatred take the wheel, Lyra would not become a queen. She would become a blood wraith, a creature that couldn't distinguish between the one who signed the death warrant and the child sleeping in the house next door. I accept, Lyra said. You accept what? Everything. She looked up at the moon. But I will not let what Kael did to me define who I become. He doesn't get to take that part of me too. Deep in the Nightfang dungeon, just as Seraphina lifted the ritual bowl from the stone table, the body hanging from the 4 silver ropes dissolved into red ash. No bones, no blood to catch. The ashes rose trailing light through the ventilation slit and drifted away from the palace. At the edge of Shadowfang 4 days' ride north of the capital, Darius Vane was patrolling the perimeter when his horses stopped and refused to move forward. A woman lay in the snow. Her hair was stark white from root to tip. Surrounding her, 11 wild wolves formed a circle and bowed their heads into the snow. Darius dismounted. He had heard his father describe that mark since he was 7, and he had never believed he would see it. The woman opened her eyes. They were the color of the blood moon. The first thing she did was not to ask who he was. She lay still, trying to find the face of the woman who had raised her, the woman who had taught her how to tie surgical stitches with one hand. She remembered the voice. She remembered the scent of dried herbs on the woman's sleeves. But the face was gone. Darius Vane was the leader of Shadowfang the land. The Nightfang crown had labeled as traitors for 4 generations. His family had kept the secret of their true lineage for as many years. 6 years ago, Kael Draven ordered a purge of Shadowfang, believing they were planning to overthrow him. Darius's father died in that purge. His 14-year-old brother died 3 days later. I had every reason in the world to bring this woman back to the fortress, wait for her to grow strong, then release her into Nightfang like fire into a granary. I took off his cloak and covered her. She woke up 3 days later in a stone room in the Shadowfang fortress, buried under 2 sheepskins with 11 wild wolves sleeping outside the door uninvited. Someone had left a basin of water by the bed. Lyra looked down, and it took a moment to recognize the face in the reflection, hair white as bone, eyes the color of the moon that had killed her. In the first 2 weeks, she learned what she had become. She called to wolves that belonged to no pack, and they came not out of fear. She placed her hand on the shoulder of a Shadowfang warrior whose pack bond had been torn during the purge, and she stitched it back together like mending a seam. Then she realized she could do the reverse. She tasted a drop of blood on a Nightfang scout's blade and saw the last 3 days of that soldier's life. She touched an alpha and stripped away his ability to shift for hours. And under the blood moon, if she called the wolf warriors of 400 years ago would rise from the earth. Everything has its limit. She hit her first bottom the day she healed a Shadowfang child whose lungs had been eaten by silver dust. The child could breathe again. That night, Lyra sat before the hearth, trying to remember the first time she met Kael Draven that afternoon at the horse fair. She remembered telling the story. She couldn't recall a single second of that afternoon anymore. The second time was worse. A mercenary tried to sneak into the fortress walls. Lyra touched his throat and stripped away his wolf, and for the next 3 breaths, she stood in the courtyard with 14 Shadowfang men around her, unable to tell who was friend or foe. The thing rising in her blood wasn't anger. It was calm, and it suggested quite reasonably that anyone standing nearby should also die. Darius dragged her out of the courtyard with a copper cord tied around both her wrists. He taught her the ancient rituals of Shadowfang, how to breathe when the blood started to speak, how to count. But he didn't trust her, and he said so plainly when she asked, "If hatred takes the wheel, you'll be more dangerous than Kael Draven. He only kills the people he orders killed." Lyra wanted to leave immediately. She said she needed 4 days' ride, and 1 blood moon night, nothing more. Darius blocked the door. "If vengeance is the only thing you want, then you're no different from the kings who destroyed my family. They made a verbal agreement before the fire, no papers signed. Darius would help her reclaim the truth and the throne that had been stolen from her lineage. Lyra would protect the common folk of Nightfang, even those who believed she was a traitor. And if she became a blood wraith, Darius had the right to kill her, no questions asked." In the capital, Kael announced to the council that Seraphina Vale would be the new Luna of Nightfang. Ever since that night in the ritual chamber, his wolf had not answered him. It was still breathing inside him, but when he called it with the authority of an alpha king, it looked at him like a stranger standing in its yard. And every night, around 3 in the morning, the spot where the mate bond had been torn would reopen. He would lie still, waiting for it to pass, calling no one, lighting no lamps. Seraphina is paying the price too, she just hasn't named it yet. The veins beneath her skin are changing color, first inside her elbows, then creeping up her neck, thin black lines traveling against the flow of her blood. The blood moon isn't rejecting her, not yet. It's accepted her, but it's consuming her from the inside out. Every time she calls upon it, it takes a little more of her in return. Lyra returned to Nightfang at the end of the second month alone, passing through the western border village, where she'd once set up her healing tent for 3 seasons straight. The first one to spot her was the fabric merchant who used to call her daughter. She took one look at the silver hair, the red eyes, and retreated into her shop. The child beside her pointed and said the one word that the whole village would repeat for the next 10 minutes: monster. Kale and Seraphina had prepared for this long before she arrived. Using the blood Lyra had left in the vial, Seraphina had accomplished something no alpha in history had ever done, a projected memory, one that others could see. In the open field in the center of the village, she conjured an image: Luna Lyra Valen sitting across from Darius Vane, hands on a map of Nightfang, both of them dividing up the spoils. Kale led 200 soldiers into the village before nightfall. He didn't call his wife by name. He told the villagers that the thing standing before them was a vampire entity that had taken the shape of their dead Luna, and that the crown was here to protect them. Lyra did the only thing she thought would be enough. She sliced her own hand, spilled her blood, and opened her blood memory for the entire village to witness. What manifested wasn't the truth. It was fragment silver wire, a bowl, the sound of someone chanting ancient syllables, and a gaping void where the afternoon of the horse fair should have been. The memories of someone who has been losing pieces of their own mind don't convince anyone. Then Seraphina projected the final image: Lyra and Darius meeting in the dark 2 weeks before Lyra was captured. The 3 soldiers in the front row were men Lyra had pulled out of the snow at the northern border with her own hands. She looked them straight in the eye and waited. All 3 looked at the ground. The thing inside her blood burst forth unbidden. She didn't remember taking a single step. When she regained her senses, 43 soldiers were on their knees, none of them able to call upon their wolves. Kale was 2 steps away, his hand too slow to reach his sword, and her fingers were already clamped around his throat. Behind him, not 10 steps away, a wagon packed with children was being shoved frantically away from the field by the villagers. Darius slammed his spear into the ground between them and called her name 3 times. They retreated into the night. On the ride back, Lyra tried to remember the sound of her father's voice reciting the names of the stars, something she always did when she needed to calm herself. She remembered the stars existed, but his voice, that was gone. What was the point of stripping 43 men of their wolves? Darius didn't turn back. By tomorrow morning, all 43 of them will tell their wives what the old Luna did to them. You just wrote Kale Draven's next speech for him. Lyra didn't answer. She sat in her saddle, staring at her hands, and realized the one thing 2 months at Shadowfang hadn't taught her: power doesn't restore the truth. It can't buy the trust of a fabric merchant. To win back Nightfang, she needed real documents, living people who dared to speak, and the ones Kale had ground into the dirt over his 4-year reign. She needed Rowan. She changed her strategy over the next 6 weeks, and she did it without fighting a single battle. She opened 4 small prisons in the outer regions where Kale had locked away those whose only crime was refusing to sign the indictment against their Luna. She brought them to Shadowfang, fed them, and took their testimonies down in her own hand. She hunted for traces of Rowan through 3 prison transfers. She followed the paper trail of fake letters and found the ink maker who had mixed the ink Malric had used, along with 2 drafts the old elder had forgotten to burn. And she kept her end of the bargain before the hearth. When a pack of vampires tore through the 2 eastern border villages, she stood there all night rebuilding the pack bonds for those who had been bitten. Those 3 villages didn't call her a monster anymore. They just didn't dare say what they were really thinking yet. That was where Kale's propaganda began to crack, not because Lyra argued against it, but because every week, dozens more people found their own reasons to stop believing it. Then Rowan was captured again, exactly 1 day's journey from his hidden archives. Kale announced it immediately. The scholar Rowan, an accomplice to the old Luna's conspiracy, would be executed during the new Luna's coronation. At the same ceremony, the Nightfang crown would publicly declare its alliance with the Crimson Veil. What the council wasn't told was that during those 3 months, Seraphina had smuggled nearly 1,000 Crimson Veil warriors into Nightfang in small groups under merchant permits signed by the king himself. She didn't intend to be the Luna of a wolf kingdom. She intended to turn it into a fortress for her own kind and use werewolf blood to keep the thing she had drunk from consuming her entirely. Lyra and Darius entered the capital 2 days before the ceremony through the sewer tunnels beneath the southern wall. The plan was clean: get Rowan out quietly, take the documents, and leave. The plan survived exactly 40 minutes. Beneath the palace, deeper than the dungeon where she had died, Lyra found a row of cells that no one above knew were still in use. 312 people. Omegas arrested for demanding land rights, warriors arrested for asking how the old Luna died, 2 border commanders who had suggested she be given a seat on the council. "If you open this block, everyone will know we're here," Darius said. "You'll lose the documents, you'll lose Rowan, and you'll lose the ceremony." "I know. You're trading the entire kingdom for 300 people." "I'm trading a ceremony." She jammed the iron bar into the first lock. "These 300 people are what I intend to use to take back the kingdom." Darius stood still for 2 heartbeats. Then he drew his spear from his back and went to open the row on the left. The next morning, the great hall of Nightfang was packed for the coronation. Seraphina knelt on the 3rd step in blood-colored finery, her collar reaching up to her jaw. Rowan was propped up beside a stone pillar, his hands bound behind him. Kale stood before the throne, his hands gripping the Luna's crown. The south door swung open. Lyra walked into the center of the hall, taking the exact path the 4 guards had dragged her through that night, and she walked alone. Kyle couldn't speak. He stood there with the crown in his hands, and the scrap of mate bond remaining in his chest gave such a violent jolt that he had to grab the armrest of the throne. "Kneel." He used every ounce of his alpha command. Lyra didn't kneel. She brought her hand to the center of her chest and snapped the final bond. The price was extracted on the spot. Her wedding day in its entirety vanished while she was still standing there. Then everything that had been coiled within that cord for all those days flowed back toward Kale. It wasn't an attack. It was simply everything she had endured intact in perfect order. The silver wire tightening around her wrists, Seraphina's needles, 217 crawls through the tunnels, and his own silver blade entering her heart. The Alpha King of Nightfang collapsed on his throne steps before his entire kingdom, his hands clutching the stone. Rowan stepped forward and opened the packet of documents he had buried beneath a craftsman's floor 19 years ago. He read every section to the council. The original unaltered timeline, 2 drafts in Malric's handwriting. The archive's ledger recording the day Kyle opened the gates to Seraphina. 94 merchant permits signed by the king. And the council's own minutes stating that reports of warriors swearing loyalty to the Luna had never been verified, with Kale Draven's signature at the bottom of the page. "I did everything to protect this kingdom," Kale said from where he sat. "You didn't protect Nightfang." Lyra wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. "You protected your throne from a wife who never wanted it." The 30 warriors in the front row turned their backs to the throne. Then the second row followed. Malric made it to the side door. There he was met by about 40 people, the wives, mothers, and children of those who had just been released from the cells. No one struck him. They simply crowded the doorway, held him fast, and waited for someone to bring the ropes. Seraphina did not wait. She left the Luna crown on the stone steps, exited through the door behind the throne, and no one could keep up with her. Below the capital, deeper than the dungeon cells, was a stone door that 4 generations of the Draven line had sealed, and she had ordered it unsealed in her first month. She cut her hand, pressed her black-veined blood against the stone, and opened the blood gate. The first sound to echo through the great hall was not footsteps. It was the long, grinding sound of stone dragging against stone. "You all still think this is Kale's kingdom?" Seraphina's voice rose up the stairwell. "It belonged to me long before the night he first set foot in those dungeons." She stepped up from the final stair, and behind her, the stone door was still widening. "I never needed your crown," Seraphina announced to the entire hall. "The title of Luna was just something I let Kyle believe I wanted. For 400 years, no one has been able to control both vampires and werewolves at once. Tonight, that changes." She wasn't lying, not by a single word, not even about Kale. She had nurtured his fear. But it was he who opened the archives. It was he who signed the 94 warrants. No one forced his hand onto the hilt of a silver sword. Seraphina tore open her collar and summoned the thing that had been consuming her for 3 months. The black veins beneath her skin erupted into a web across her body, and her form shifted. She grew taller, her cheekbones sharpened, and her eyes took on the same blood moon color as Lyra's, though rimmed in black. Then she called the names of the 47 Nightfang warriors who had been fed blood in the ritual 3 months prior. All 47 rose in unison, their eyes vacant, stripped of every shred of their own will. Lyra knew she had a way to end this in 3 heartbeats. Open everything. Summon all 400 years of wolf warriors buried beneath the city's stone and incinerate Serafina along with the blood she had consumed. The cost was clearly laid out in the terms. The capital would become a crater. Thousands in the streets around the palace would die instantly, and the remaining fragments of her memories would be almost entirely wiped away. After that night she would win, but she would no longer remember what she had won for. "Let me fight beside you." Kale had managed to stand. "I know I have no right to ask. Let me pay for part of this." "You can't pay for anything of mine." Lyra barely looked at him. "But out there are 4,000 people in the streets around the palace. Go get them past the city walls. That is something you can do." That night the Nightfang capital split into 3 fronts, and no single front was held by just one person. Darius led the Shadowfang to block the Crimson Veil army on the field outside the East Gate. Kale went back into the narrow streets, pulling the warriors who had once sworn under his command out of the burning houses with his own hands. Rowan and the Omega group, having just exited the cells, hunted for the 6 ritual pillars Serafina had erected beneath the city's foundation, shattering each one with their hammers. And Lyra remained in the great hall with the only friend who knew she was afraid of deep water. "Look around you," Serafina said. "The husband you loved killed you. Your people call you a monster. The 3 soldiers you pulled out of the snow all keep their eyes on the ground. Everyone who ever loved you has either sold you out or fears you. Why are you still holding on to this kingdom?" The thing in Lyra's blood surged to her throat, calm and rational, and for one heartbeat she almost agreed with it. Then she heard the echo of Rowan's hammer rising from beneath the stone floor. She didn't open everything. She did the exact opposite. She lowered her hand, forced the entire surge to move in another direction, and reached out to the 47 pack bonds that Serafina held in her grip. She didn't sever them. She mended them. The 47 warriors collapsed to the hall floor, the light returning to their eyes. And in the center of the hall, Serafina was left alone with the thing inside her, with no one left to share the burden. The price for that was taken before Lyra could pull her hand back the face of Kale Draven. During the years he was the husband she had loved. The last fragment of memory she held of him was wiped away as cleanly as chalk from stone. She still knew who he was. She just couldn't imagine anymore why she had ever married that man. The black veins on Serafina's skin faded. She shriveled, growing smaller, returning to the true form of a woman who had spent 40 years on something that never truly accepted her. "Lyra," she braced a hand against the floor. "That summer you were the one who put this necklace around my neck. You remember, don't you? You remember who I am." "I don't need to remember who you used to be," Lyra said, "to know what you chose to become." Serafina pulled the silver shard from her sleeve and threw it with her last ounce of strength. Kale had returned to the great hall unnoticed by anyone. He didn't call Lyra's name, didn't offer a warning, didn't say a word. He simply stepped into the path of the shard, and it buried itself more than halfway into his chest. He dropped to the floor right before her feet. The blood flowed faster than anyone in the hall could manage. "Let me die like this," he said. "Let me die as the one who saved you. Don't take that away from me too." Lyra knelt beside him. She placed her hand over the wound and did nothing for 3 heartbeats. Long enough to understand that if she pulled her hand away it would all be over. He would die as the one who shielded her. And those 4 years would be closed out with a beautiful story that he wouldn't have to pay another cent for. Death would spare him the hardest part. She healed him. She did not return his power. The verdict was read 3 days later in the great courtyard before all who wished to hear. Kale Draven was stripped of the title of Alpha King. He lost command of the pack. He was forbidden from shifting for many years. He had to stand before the people of Nightfang and read his own crimes aloud. The forged letters, the reports he knew were unverified. The Shadowfang purged the dungeons beneath the palace, and that night in the ritual chamber. And he had to rebuild with his own hands the villages that had been burned or abandoned under his reign. She did not take his memories. "Death would let you forget the pain," she told him before the soldiers took him away. "I want you to live long enough to understand that I was never your enemy. Seraphina Vale was stripped entirely of the blood she had consumed. They imprisoned her in the very cell where Lyra had died, and no one was permitted to touch her. No beatings, no silver chains, no starvation. Every night the only thing that visited her were the memories of those who died because of her schemes. The 47 warriors who had been forced to drink the blood, the people in the cells, the villagers from the borderlands, and the woman who had personally placed the silver necklace around her neck at 17. The old council was dissolved that same week. Lyra Valen ascended as the Blood Moon Queen of Nightfang, and the first thing she did was not put on the crown. She had a new charter carved into the stone at the city gates. No alpha could dictate the fate of their mate without a trial. Omegas were allowed to own land and choose their own packs. The council was required to have seats for warriors for Omegas and for representatives from regions once exiled. No one could be convicted of treason without a public hearing. The Shadowfang had their honor restored in the archives and became an equal part of the kingdom. Darius Vane did not become Lyra's new man. He stayed by her side as an ally, a consultant, and the only person who dared tell her to her face that she had gone too far that night. The agreement by the hearth remained in effect, the final clause included. What was between them began with trust, and they let it begin slowly. A year later, in a village to the west that had been abandoned for 4 years, Cale Draven was framing the roof of his 11th house when the Queen's procession passed by. He climbed down from the scaffolding. He remembered everything. He remembered the night she defied his orders to reach the northern border and pulled him out of the snow. He remembered her standing before the council saying she wasn't asking for more power. He remembered her offering to cut the mate bond so he could sleep. He even remembered that afternoon at the horse fair, a memory that now only one of the two of them still held. Lyra walked through her people, stopped at a stall, and rested her hand on the swollen knee of an old woman. Then she looked up and caught sight of the man standing by the pile of timber. She looked at him the way one looks at a stranger who has just offered a polite nod. Civil, empty. There was nothing left behind those eyes because the part that should have been there was taken the night she chose to stitch 47 bonds instead of burning the entire capital to the ground. The procession moved on. Kyle stood there for a long time, and finally he understood the full weight of the prophecy. He had read 4 times in the archives a lifetime ago, when the king betrays the blood moon, it is he who creates the queen who brings death to his throne. Lyra was never born to destroy him. She was born to heal her people, and she married him on a summer neither of them can remember. It was his own insecurity, his desperate thirst to hold on to the throne, and that night he chose the silver blade instead of a 30-minute investigation that carved out the death sentence for both him and the woman who once stood behind the altar stone with the sacrificial bowl. He picked up the next piece of wood and went back to his work because that was all that remained for him to do. If you would like to hear more stories like this, please stay with the channel for the next one.